In episode 40, titled 4.1 Design for Clarity, Labels, Legends, Branding, and Color Schemes, design is treated as a correctness control rather than a cosmetic step. A chart can contain the right numbers and still be wrong in practice if the audience misreads the unit, confuses categories, or interprets color as meaning that was never intended. Clarity prevents arguments because it reduces the number of plausible interpretations a viewer can form in a quick glance, which is exactly how most visuals are consumed in real meetings and on dashboards. The exam angle is that good analysts communicate results, so the intended conclusion is the easiest conclusion to reach, and the chart itself carries the context needed to interpret it. This episode focuses on the small design choices that create that outcome, because those choices are where trust is either reinforced or quietly lost. Labels are the first line of defense, and the best labels explicitly state what the numbers represent rather than assuming the viewer will infer it. A label that says revenue can be ambiguous, while a label that says net revenue after refunds in US dollars makes meaning concrete and prevents a common class of disputes. Labels should also reflect the population and time frame when those elements are essential to interpretation, such as active subscribers in the last 30 days instead of just active users. Axis labels benefit from units and from stable wording that stays the same across report cycles, because small label drift can be mistaken for metric drift. When labels are precise, the chart becomes self-explanatory enough that the viewer does not need a separate narration to understand what is being measured. Legends can help, but they often become clutter. So a practical rule is to use legends only when needed and otherwise label directly where the data appears. A legend forces the viewer to move their eyes back and forth, matching colors or symbols to categories, and that friction increases the chance of misinterpretation under time pressure. Direct labeling, such as labeling a line at its endpoint or labeling a bar with its category name, reduces cognitive load and makes the chart easier to read in a meeting setting. Legends are most justified when there are multiple series that cannot be labeled cleanly without overlapping, or when the same categories appear across many charts and the legend remains consistent. When legends are used, they should be ordered logically and placed so they do not compete with the data area, because the goal is still for the data to remain the center of attention. Color schemes should be chosen for readability for everyone, not for novelty, because color is a communication channel with accessibility implications. A good color scheme preserves contrast between categories and preserves readability when printed in grayscale or viewed on a projector, where subtle differences can vanish. Color should also be used to encode meaning consistently, such as using one color family for positive movement and another for negative movement, but only when that mapping is stable and clearly explained. Too many colors increase confusion, especially when categories are numerous and similar, so limiting the palette often improves comprehension more than adding variety. The safest posture is to treat color as a high-impact choice that can either clarify or mislead, and to prefer simple, high-contrast selections that remain legible across common viewing conditions. Branding belongs in reports, but it should stay subtle so the data remains the focus and the viewer's attention is not pulled toward logos and decorative elements. Light branding can help establish ownership and credibility, such as a small logo, a consistent header style, and a stable font choice that matches organizational standards. The danger is when branding becomes heavy, such as large watermarks or dominant colors, which can reduce contrast and reduce the chart's ability to communicate values accurately. Branding should support recognition and trust without competing with the message, which is why placement and scale matter. A simple way to evaluate branding is asking whether the chart would still be readable and persuasive if the branding were removed, because if it would not, the design may have prioritized identity over clarity. Consistency in units, date formats, and category names is a clarity control because inconsistency forces the viewer to reinterpret each chart instead of comparing them cleanly. Units should not shift from dollars to thousands of dollars without making that change explicit, and percentages should be labeled as percentages rather than left ambiguous as decimals. Date formats should stay stable because switching between month-day and day-month formats can confuse readers and create wrong assumptions about time ordering. Category names should be standardized across the report since email, and email appearing separately can look like a genuine segmentation when it is actually a data cleaning issue. Consistency reduces cognitive overhead, and it also reduces the chance that a reader interprets a formatting change as a real business change. Clutter is the enemy of comprehension, so reducing clutter often improves truthfulness by making the pattern easier to see. Unnecessary grid lines, dense tick marks, and heavy background shading can distract the eye and imply precision that the data does not support. Noise also includes excessive data labels that overlap and turn the chart into a wall of text, which can paradoxically reduce the viewer's ability to find the main takeaway. A clean design uses only the minimal scaffolding needed to interpret scale and categories, with enough structure to read values, but not so much that the structure competes with the signal. When clutter is reduced, anomalies and trends become more visible, which is often the point of showing the chart in the first place. Comparisons should be supported with aligned scales and consistent baselines because misaligned comparisons are one of the fastest ways to create misleading impressions. When two charts use different axis ranges, one can look volatile and the other stable, even if the underlying variation is similar, which can lead to incorrect prioritization. Baselines matter because changes are interpreted relative to where the axis begins, and truncating an axis can exaggerate small differences, while overly wide axes can hide meaningful shifts. When comparisons are intended, the design should make that intention explicit by using the same units, the same time window, and the same scale range where feasible. This consistency does not prevent nuanced analysis, but it does prevent accidental storytelling through scale manipulation. A quarterly report scenario highlights these clarity choices because quarterly reporting often compares periods, compares regions, and drives decisions about budget and operational focus. In that setting, clarity begins with ensuring each metric uses the same definition across quarters, because definition drift can look like performance change. It continues with labeling that includes the period boundary, such as which dates define the quarter, and whether the quarter reflects fiscal or calendar definitions, because that affects comparability. Color and legend choices should help the reader compare the same categories quarter over quarter without searching, which is why consistent category ordering and consistent color mapping matter. In a quarterly context, the audience often scans quickly, so the charts should carry enough context to prevent misreads without requiring long narrative explanations. Accessibility can be supported by thinking in contrast and colorblind safe patterns because a design that only works for a subset of viewers is not fully correct communication. Contrast ensures that text is readable against backgrounds and that series are distinguishable when projected or printed, which is a common real-world requirement. Colorblind safe thinking means avoiding relying solely on red and green contrasts and instead using differences in lightness, pattern, or clear direct labels when color distinction may be unreliable. Accessibility also includes font size, spacing, and avoiding cramped labels, since small text becomes unreadable on shared screens. When accessibility is considered, the chart becomes robust across viewers and environments, which increases the chance the intended message survives real consumption. Decorative effects should be avoided when they distort perception of values, because design should never compete with measurement accuracy. Three-dimensional effects can change the perceived size of bars and slices, making one value look larger than it is relative to another. Heavy gradients and shadows can draw attention to style rather than to magnitude, and they can reduce contrast in ways that hide smaller values entirely. Excessive animation, where used, can also distract from the core pattern and make comparisons harder, especially when the viewer needs a stable image to reason about differences. The guiding principle is that the chart should represent values as faithfully as possible, and any decoration that interferes with that goal is a clarity risk. A simple test of comprehension is describing the chart in words, because if the chart cannot be summarized clearly, it likely contains too many elements or lacks necessary context. A clear chart can be described with what it measures, what time window it covers, what the main pattern is, and what the key comparison shows, all in a couple of sentences. If describing it requires frequent caveats about units, definitions, or scale, that suggests the design is missing labels or is using inconsistent formatting that forces explanation. This verbal test is especially useful in an audio-first environment because it aligns with how insights must be communicated without relying on the viewer's ability to decode a crowded visual. When the chart passes the word test, it usually also passes the meaning test. A clarity checklist becomes effective when it is applied every time as a routine rather than as a last-minute polish, because routine prevents recurring mistakes. The checklist begins with labels that state what is measured, in what units, for what population, and for what time window. It then checks whether legends are needed or whether direct labeling can reduce eye movement, and it checks whether color choices remain readable under common viewing conditions and accessible for different viewers. It continues with consistency in units and formatting across comparable charts, reduction of clutter that does not add meaning, and alignment of scales and baselines where comparisons are intended. Finally, it applies the comprehension test, describing the chart in words to confirm the intended takeaway is obvious and defensible. When this checklist is habitual, clarity becomes part of correctness, not a separate design step. The conclusion of episode 40 sets one clarity change to make this week because small design improvements compound into a reporting style that stakeholders learn to trust. The change might be upgrading labels to include units and definitions, replacing a cluttered legend with direct labeling, or aligning scales across a set of comparison charts so visual impressions match numeric reality. It might also be simplifying color usage to improve accessibility and reduce confusion, or removing decorative effects that distract from magnitude. The best change is one that removes a known source of misunderstanding, because clarity improvements are most valuable when they prevent a repeated debate or misread. One deliberate clarity upgrade this week strengthens both exam performance and real-world influence, because the same numbers become more actionable when they are communicated in a form that is hard to misinterpret. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.